You can always tell which texts are on the syllabus for nearby schools by the number of copies found in local charity shops. This is clearly one of them. The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold is the story of Susie Salmon, yes, like the fish, a 14-year-old girl who is raped and murdered on her way home from school. Not the spoiler you think it is, because all that happens in the first chapter. The rest of the book details the fallout, how her family and friends deal with their loss, as told by Susie's ghost watching from heaven. This is a fascinating premise, by all accounts, but does it live up to its expectation? I mean, it's got to be a modern classic for a reason, right? So this book was better than I was expecting, especially the opening chapters. Possibly that's because I had heard some pretty bad things about it, so I went in with a fairly low set bar. But I was expecting something awful, and I got something passable, so yeah. And as I said, it's got a good premise. I like how it throws you straight into the horror of Susie's attack so early on in the book. The way the story is told is quite fragmented as well, which I also liked because it sort of echoed how the characters' lives have splintered in the aftermath, and it reflects Susie's constantly changing focus as she watches all these lives unfold. This is also supported by a very pared-back writing style, for the most part, and I did enjoy the initial almost Columbo-type feel to the investigation into Susie's murder, as we, the reader, know who did it, but the police don't. So you're not solving the murder, but you're trying to work out how they'll solve it. Again, this is all at first. It does change. One of the main complaints I have seen about this book is to do with the writing style, which initially I didn't really get. So for the most part, it's quite plain and stark, which, as I said, fits the overall tone. But looking back, there are some odd choices of metaphor and simile, a sort of attempt to be very poetic in a fresh, quirky way that doesn't really fit. I hadn't picked up on them at first, possibly because I was speed reading this on a 5-hour train journey and already in a bad mood, which got progressively worse as the book got weirder. And, you know, having survived the strangeness of Nevernight and its treasure trove of bizarre imagery, buttering toast with tears and flower petal eyes are tame and almost sensible. It was a buck-toothed little hole, and no mistake. Not the most miserable building in all creation. But if the inn were a man and you stumbled on him in a bar, you'd be forgiven for assuming he had, after agreeing enthusiastically to his wife's request to bring another woman into their marriage bed, discovered his bride making up a pallet for him in the guest room. Does that evoke an image of the inn? I don't know if I should be understanding the inn as run down or as bitterly downing a pint whilst wearing a new Mugtail t-shirt. The other complaint, which I full-heartedly agree with and found very disconcerting, is this book's attitude towards sex. From minor things like feeling distinctly uncomfortable reading about 14-year-olds getting it on, to some pretty concerning and inappropriate events later on. Spoilers, by the way, for those who care. The climax of the book sees Susie's ghost temporarily possess the body of a woman called Ruth, who had been a classmate of hers in life. Whilst in Ruth's body, Susie has many sexy times with her old crush, Ray. Bearing in mind, this is something like 10 years after she dies. Ruth may or may not have let Susie into her body, but the fact Susie then uses Ruth's body to have sex with someone is just really disturbing. Never mind the fact she chooses to have sex with this guy instead of, talking to her family, or seeing her younger brother all grown up, or meeting her sister's boyfriend. It's all very strange and quite sad that she essentially chooses physical gratification over family. This scene is also incredibly disturbing for how rapey it all seemed. So Ruth is very strongly implied to be a lesbian. She kisses this boy a couple of times but never really feels anything, which is okay, fine. And then she does, which is a bit weird, but that doesn't really go anywhere, so never mind. Then she's used by Susie to have sex with Ray, which felt rapey because the girl didn't consent to her body being used in that way, and it felt a little bit like she was being robbed of her identity as a gay woman, and it seemed odd to add that caveat to a character only to have it essentially erased by the narrative. It all felt a bit strange and I didn't like it. The ending was also quite unsatisfying, for me anyway. This book maybe isn't necessarily supposed to be happy, obviously, but the ending was meant to be cathartic, a release. But when so much of the book is dedicated to this investigation and the family trying to pinpoint the guy that had done it and find evidence and get him convicted, and they don't, he escapes. He essentially gets away with it. He's never arrested or prosecuted. I think by the end the police are looking for him, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And then Susie's ghost kills him via icicle and ravine. So I suppose there's justice for her personally, but not for her family. I don't know, it felt like the author was trying to give closure, but it didn't really work for me. And generally, after the first part of the book, the immediate aftermath of the death, the rest just got a bit boring and frustrating, and you found yourself forcing yourself through, hoping that closure was around the bend, and it didn't really manifest. And there were a lot of other bits that you just didn't really want to read about, like the mum having an affair and essentially buggering off for no good reason, and the sister was just a bit odd, and it wasn't interesting in a sort of character study way, because they were all too terrible, but not in a dramatic enough way. It's very strange. But he seemed to have missed both the interestingly terrible characters, but also the characters you genuinely care about. And it fell in this weird middle ground that wasn't very interesting. I get why people like it. It's experimental in a very accessible sort of a way. People feel smart for reading and understanding it. But I can also see why people really hate it. As if you look at it in any real detail, you see all these disturbing undercurrents and this sort of conceited writing style that thinks it's smarter and more poetic than it actually is. But most of all, I can see why most copies of this end up in the charity shops, and that is exactly where this one is going. That's all I've got time for. See you next time. Goodbye.